The stories. This abandoned cabin is a warning trap in winter. The old cabin beside the county line looks empty from the road during storms. Yet a warm porch light appears. Drivers aim for it when whiteout wipes the world because a light means shelter, or at least a neighbor. Rhea Calder is 36 and works as a county snow operations supervisor, and she keeps a spiral notebook of storm anomalies. She shows up before dawn, checks blades and salt loads, and marks complaint calls with a thin blue pen. Her goal this morning is simple: get the ridge plowed before the school runs, then swing by a trouble spot. The spot is a bend near an abandoned mining cabin, where people keep calling for help when the sky goes white. The incident that changes her plan starts with two archived calls that ping the same mile marker and both mention the same porch light. The first caller said the light flicked on like someone waved them in, and then their SUV sank past the axle in drifted powder. The second caller said he saw reflective stakes like a private driveway, and he trusted the stakes and followed them in. Rhea drives out with a plow and a county ranger, and the wind pulls spindrift across the hood like milk. She idles beside the bend, then walks the last stretch on a packed lane that should not exist. The lane is narrow, precisely the width of a small plow, and the snow on its edges shows a scalloped bite that her crews do not leave. She studies the porch light, which is wired to a salvaged marine battery and a hockey puck-sized solar panel. The cabin window is boarded, yet bare footprints cross the porch, and the snow on the mat is tamped smooth with a boot heel. A battery radio inside clicks on and off on weather band, then goes silent like a timer has died. A tow truck appears before Rhea can call the last caller back, and the driver waves from a bright red cab. He introduces himself as Tully Grange, and he says he just happened to be nearby, which is unlikely on a weekday morning before the bus runs. He backs toward the trapped SUV with a practiced arc, then stops when Rhea holds up a hand. "This is county equipment," she says. And he shrugs, then says he can wait in the pullout. She notes the pullout was not there last week, because she passed here in a smaller storm and saw only brush and drift. The fresh gravel under his tires is a tan quartz blend not used by their supplier, which her crews call peach pit gravel because it stains gloves. Complication lands in small details that refuse to match, and details are the only honest witnesses in bad weather. The reflective stakes near the porch are county colors, yet the plastic sleeves are slightly glossy, which means hardware store knockoffs. The stake spacing mirrors a county driveway template, yet the end flare is reversed, which a training manual would not allow. She opens her spiral and writes the count of stakes and the order of colors, then photographs each with her phone. The ranger sets a trail camera on a fence post, angled at the bend, and another on the porch beam, both tagged with the hour and coordinates. Rhea pulls a corner of the mat and finds two zip ties and a clipped wire, both wet from this morning, not last week. Investigation moves step by step when the storm pauses and the phones ring less, so she visits a gas station near the turnoff. The clerk says a red tow truck fills up on calm days and buys coffee for anyone who mentions the cabin. A retired school bus driver named Lauren Ibarra stops for a paper, and he says he saw private plow tracks peel off before the storm, then vanish in wind. She requests dispatch logs for the past 3 winters and filters for that mile marker, then highlights clusters that pair with heavy snow. Callers mention the same porch light, the same reflective stakes, and the same quick tow arrival, which dispatch marks as helpful. She watches a dash cam clip from last month where the light clicks on as the hood swings left, then the video ends with a soft crunch. Archived calls from 2021 mention a ham radio voice that says shelter is nearby, and then silence like a squelch cut. A volunteer firefighter says in a witness statement that the cabin used to be a safety cache and now nobody claims ownership. A Forest Service mail thread she prints at the office says the cabin fell off the map after a boundary change in 2019. Rhea returns with 2 crew trucks and a trooper who knows every rancher along that ridge, and they wait for nightfall. A thin moon slides behind blown cloud, and the porch light pops alive at the first gust, soft and steady like a welcome sign. A compact pickup rolls up from the far side with its lights off, then a figure hops out and crouches at the porch corner. The ranger whispers that the figure holds a small remote, and the light changes from dim to bright after a thumb tap. Rhea steps forward and says, "Good evening," and the figure bolts toward the pickup, then slips where the packed lane meets churned gravel. The trooper covers the exit with his lights, and the pickup idles in a pool of steam, and the figure surrenders with hands up. They identify him as a subcontractor to Grange Recovery, and his jacket pockets hold a keychain remote and 2 spare batteries. Zip ties match the ones under the mat, and a roll of reflective tape matches the stakes, which are cut to driveway template lengths. He says he was only maintaining a safety light and keeping the lane open, which is not a service the county requested. Rhea stays methodical because motive hides under habit, not speeches that arrive too fast. She asks where the gravel came from, and he says a supplier in the valley, yet the receipts in his glove box show a hardware warehouse 2 counties south. She asks why the radio trips a loop on weatherband after the door opens, and he says it helps people feel calm. She compiles a timeline that starts with a bridge closure 3 winters ago, which pushed navigation apps toward this county road. Drivers used the cabin light as a wayfinder during whiteouts, while their maps insisted the bend belonged to a safe connector. The subcontractor and a partner groomed a false lane with a small plow, then dragged a lure line past the porch to a drift. Vehicles followed the stakes and the shine, then sank where the wind always filled the cut, and then a tow contract appeared fast. The subcontractor had a scanner tuned for dispatch, and he shadowed snow squalls, then nudged the light when a hood turned. The porch light served as both promise and bait, a warning tone that pretended to help while herding people toward trouble. The twist clicks when Rhea notices something everyone else ignored, because details are stubborn and patient when money moves. The stakes used county colors, yet the white stripe appears cream at dusk, which happens when old tape yellows in cold. The county only switched to that tape after a backorder last spring, yet the stakes showed last winter, which means someone copied and refreshed. She pulls a photo from the first cluster of calls and zooms on a stake that leans at a slant near a spruce. A boot print sits at the base with a split heel pattern, and the subcontractor wears the same make, which the trooper confirms. The peach pit gravel under the pullout matches bags stacked in the pickup bed, stamped with a store brand not used locally. They bring in Tully Grange on a quiet afternoon, and he arrives calm, carrying a thermos with a sticker from a drag racing track. He says he never told anyone to follow that light, and he is right in the narrow way salesmen are right. He made sure the light stayed visible from the highway, and he made sure the false lane looked exactly like a private driveway. Rhea uses her spiral notes and dispatch timestamps and the dashcam clip to assemble a proof that a prosecutor can lift. The proof is plain. The lane grooming aligns with tow arrivals, and the light remote explains the synchronized porch glow. The radio loop satisfies a claim of safety service, yet the loop trips only when a door opens after a driver commits. Witnesses give short statements. A school custodian says he saw stakes in a truck behind the parts store, and a rancher remembers a trailer loaded with gravel. A hardware buyer confirms past orders of reflective sleeves and tape and county patterns, then prints invoices with dates that match storm weeks. The trail camera video shows the subcontractor stepping off distances with a tape measure, then pressing reflectors into drifted banks. The county files charges on false markings and a long list of fraud-related counts, and the state adds a charge tied to interference. Rhea builds a corrective plan with simple steps: remove the stakes, angle the porch light away from the bend, and post clear closure boards. She requests new advance signs that warn of no outlet during storms, and the road team builds a berm past the bend. In spring, she visits the cabin in daylight when the stream runs high and the spruce throws a clean shadow. The boards are still up, and the marine battery sits in a crate with a tag that says evidence in blocky marker. She writes a last page in the spiral: cabin neutralized, tow arrivals normal, and local drivers back to watching the sky instead of a lure. She keeps the dashcam clip on her work desktop as a reminder of how easily stressed people choose the first light they see. She writes a line on a training slide: never chase glow in a whiteout, choose distance markers and windbreaks and patience. She speaks at a town meeting using plain words, then thanks the bus drivers and the ranch hands who notice small things that save bigger things. According to a statement filed later, the subcontractor said he borrowed the idea from a forum where recovery outfits shared winter tips. The forum is archived now, and the thread title mentions hazard magnets, which makes her jaw tighten in a quiet office. She forwards the archive to a state liaison, then shuts her laptop and listens to the heater tick inside the shop. 2 winters later, a driver who once followed the light sends the department a short letter with a photo of the bend in Sunday. The letter says, "Thank you for fixing the trap, and thank you for posting signs that speak like a human, not a brochure." Rhea pins the photo on the bulletin board and draws a small check beside the mile marker on a laminated map. The cabin still stands, where the wind stacks powder against the wall, and a jay hops along the porch rail after a thaw. People talk about that porch like a lucky star in a bad stretch. Yet the real luck was a person with a notebook. A false beacon is a cruel thing in winter, and the fix was not a heroic beatdown, only careful eyes and a stop. She drives past when each first snow begins, then checks the berm and the markers and the culvert past the spruce. The road hums under studded tires, and the bend looks like any other bend in a county full of the same bends. She knows a trap can wear a smile and a soft bulb, and a warning means nothing unless it points away from harm. The old cabin still looks empty if you do not look close, and light can lie when money needs help. Rhea prefers the dull honesty of a reflector that never blinks, and a berm that refuses to pretend it is a road. She closes her spiral at the end of each shift and treats winter like a puzzle that pays back the patient mind. The tunnel collapse outside Talkeetna. Locals in Talkeetna still mention the sound that rolled across the Spruce Flats shortly after dinner on a warm evening. A dull report, followed by a long shiver, came from the service tunnel east of the Parks Highway pullout where tourists park. Some residents said the ground trembled like a freight car slipping its brake, while others described a brief settling hush. Investigators never confirmed a single cause, and the first accounts arrived scattered across radio traffic like drifting snow. The earliest entry in dispatch logs marked a vague disturbance with no location pinned to a milepost. The service tunnel lay under a retired gravel spur that once fed a small quarry along the Susitna River flats near Talkeetna. Built for drainage and utility access in the 1970s, it carried cables and a narrow culvert beneath the raised bed. State records held surveying notes that described fractured silt lenses and frost heave risks beneath the pad, though the quarry closed decades later. During breakup, the culvert took meltwater toward a muskeg swale where moose browsed willow shoots every spring. The structure looked ordinary from the road, which likely explains why few people noticed changes through late summer. On the day of the collapse, a maintenance foreman named Mark Ellison drove north from Wasilla with a coil of fiber line. He was 52, employed by a regional contractor that serviced rural communication runs across the borough. His work order listed a periodic inspection of ground boxes near the decommissioned spur with a note about intermittent signal loss. Archived notes from earlier site checks mentioned minor seepage around a junction pedestal, but no structural objection recorded beyond seasonal frost. Ellison told his dispatcher he expected a quick look and promised to be back before dark reached the river bars. At the same time, a seasonal guide named Lena Ortega left town in a dusty crossover to scout a shortcut for autumn tours. She was 29, employed by an outfit that led small groups to river overlooks and berry patches outside Talkeetna. The proprietor reportedly wanted a safer route that avoided the rutted turnoff where buses stuck during heavy rain last year. Ortega carried a laminated map, a handheld radio, and a habit of text updates that showed time-stamped pings near the highway. The route she intended traced close to the old spur, where alder thickets crowded the edge of the embankment. The third person to figure later was Deputy Caleb Rusk, who logged on for an evening patrol from the borough substation. He was 41, a steady responder who preferred paperwork correct and calls closed without drama when roads iced. Rusk's shift calendar placed him between Talkeetna and Sunshine when the first complaint reached the radio net from a tourist. Some locals claimed they heard the report minutes earlier, which made the timeline messy before the first officer reached the pullout. County File from 2009 described similar confusion during a culvert slump near Willow that produced mismatched clock stamps across channels. According to dispatch logs, Ellison checked in at a utility box at 1943 with routine language and a calm tone. He then called again at 1950, giving a short remark about water inside the pedestal that soaked a bottom bracket. The recording cut with a click that sounded like a glove against a mic, which technicians later marked as incidental noise. Investigators never confirmed whether he entered the tunnel or remained beside the hatch that led to the concrete throat. His truck stayed parked on the gravel with a door ajar, as if he meant to return after a brief inspection. Ortega texted a coworker at 1955 with a photo of berry ground glinting under long sun near the spur. She followed with a second photo of tire ruts that curled toward willows beside the embankment where the tunnel sat unseen. The message after that used a shorter line about a hollow sound underfoot, which could have meant an old box. Some locals claimed she loved writing dramatic notes that overstated ordinary field quirks, yet her manager disputed that habit later. Her radio chirp at 1959 carried wind and water like a whisper when recorded on the station console. Rusk parked at the pullout at 2011 and met two travelers who reported dust rising near the alder screen by the spur. He walked the gravel shoulder and saw Ellison's truck with hazard lights clicking against an empty quiet that felt slightly wrong. The deputy radioed for a welfare check at the site and requested a second unit from Sunshine with standard cautionary wording. He then followed a footpath that split through hops of sedge where the ground thinly crusted above damp peat. His flashlight found the hatch leaning crooked with one hinge bent, while small stones slid into a widening dark gap. Engineers later wrote that the tunnel roof probably sheared along a cold joint that never bonded cleanly during original placement. Freeze-thaw cycles likely pushed against that line until an unusually wet season softened the surrounding silt enough to let it move. State records mentioned runoff totals that exceeded mid-range by several inches during late May and again in early August. Whether vibration from traffic or a subtle settling tick crossed the final threshold remained uncertain after multiple modeling attempts. The concrete segments slumped in stages which matched witness comments about two distinct sounds separated by minutes rather than a single collapse. Search activity began before midnight, with lights cast across low trees and a slow noise like a generator on a far porch. Volunteers from Talkeetna cleared brush while a tow driver secured Ellison's truck away from the lip where the gravel cracked. A rope team placed anchors on the railbed and dropped cameras that showed fractured slabs and water pooling in blind pockets. Some locals claimed a man called up from the dark, which others dismissed as static and wind refracting inside concrete. Investigators never confirmed a voice, and the audio clip on the case server held only hiss and sloshing echoes. By morning, a pump crew from the borough moved water while a geotech plotted safe zones along a chalked line on the pad. Ortega's crossover appeared on a game camera a mile south around dusk, which placed her near but not fixed at the site. Her phone last pinged a roadside tower at 2023 and then went quiet, which technicians called ordinary for that valley. Archived notes from similar corridors described shadow zones that confuse signals when weather and terrain line up against small devices. The absence complicated mapping, yet did not prove movement one way or another before responders closed public access around the spur. Ellison's helmet turned up near the hatch with a scrape across the brim that matched a hinge corner on the broken lid. His tool belt sat on the gravel with a coil of line draped across a stake as if he paused to check the latch. A narrow pry bar lay close by with a clean tip, which suggested the lid gave way without hard effort that night. Whether he stepped onto a floating slab or leaned across the opening stayed unsettled after interviews and simulations by the team. The working theory held that a small section slipped first, which invited a misstep followed by that deeper slide. Rusk wrote a measured report that avoided drama and kept his timestamps aligned with the console extracts on the server. He noted footprints that matched Ellison's boots on the lip and lighter prints that could fit Ortega, though soil made that uncertain. The deputy also logged faint prints from a moose calf that had crossed the pad earlier, which muddied impressions near the broken hatch. County file from 2009 warned about wildlife tracks, confusing scenes when soft fines overlay crushed river gravel near culverts. The manual suggested photographs at low angles, which the deputy used, while the second unit kept tourists away from the shoulder. Crews shored the tunnel by afternoon and advanced along brace spans with boards laid to float weight across pockets. Cameras revealed a backpack snagged on rebar with a company logo that matched Ellison's firm, yet the tag was not attached. A laminated map later washed from a side pocket and bore notes in tidy handwriting that matched Ortega according to workplace forms. Some locals claimed that proved they both went inside, while engineers countered the items could have slid from the surface during slumps. Investigators never confirmed sequence because sediment had moved like heavy smoke behind a fan that could not be rewound. 1 week later, divers explored the downstream culvert mouth at the Muskeg Swale and found a coil of fiber line in brown water. The coil lacked brakes, which suggested Ellison never pulled it through any conduit during his visit to the junction that night. A boot with lodgepole grit turned up near willow roots, which fit his size, yet showed no decisive mark beyond silt scuff. State records cataloged the item without a matching pair, which sometimes happens when suction holds one while the other drifts through. The absence of a second boot and the quiet along the pad kept theories moving without a single solid anchor. Interviews gathered at the roadhouse turned contradictory, where retired quarry hands remembered different drainage fixes done in the 1980s. Some recalled grout injections around the seam, while others remembered only gravel top-ups after a frost buckle that wintered poorly. Archived notes from a subcontractor folder described planned reinforcement that later carried a red stamp that read "postponed by budget." Whether the work happened under a different purchase order remained unclear because several boxes from that period were flooded during a roof leak. The record trail thinned like tracks after a thaw, which made the structural story patchy and dependent on memory that wandered. Ortega's manager shared messages that painted a careful worker who kept to daylight and logged routes on a paper pad. A page from that pad surfaced near the embankment a month later with rain stains and a note about a hollow sound. Some locals claimed the note was showmanship, while others saw a cautious marker used to flag ground that felt suspect. Investigators never confirmed whether her last movements brought her to the hatch or just along the shoulder within sightlines. The company kept her name on the roster through the season, while the tours shifted to a northern loop near Sunshine. Winter closed around the tunnel with plywood bracing and a fence that leaned under snowdrift load as the highway quieted. Engineers sketched a full grout fill for spring, along with a new culvert and a plan to backfill voids with controlled material. State records noted that funding passed a final review with a brief line that mentioned the unusual uncertainty about human involvement. Whether anyone remained inside depended on unproven pre-collapse entries that lacked clear video or eyewitnesses on the gravel pad. Some residents left small flags on willow stems, while others drove by without slowing because the road carried too many questions already. When thaw returned, the crew pumped the tunnel again and advanced with boards across the span to the furthest stable chamber. They recovered a radio that matched Ortega's issued unit with corrosion that hid numbers, yet yielded one short clip of wind. The clip sounded like water coursing through a tight throat, while gravel popped against concrete in the slack of a bend. Investigators never confirmed whether that audio preceded or followed the initial slump because digital clocks often drift during cold storage. The unit went into evidence, and the report added another uncertain marker to a file already layered with careful hedging. By summer, the borough signed off on repair, and the fence came down while the spur remained posted against foot traffic. A brass marker sits near the hatch that no longer opens, which says "Access Limited" and lists a phone number for permits. The marker stands beside a low alder where berries gather in small clusters that dye fingers purple by late August. Some locals claimed a shape moves under the pad during heavy rain, though the engineer insisted it is water finding the new path. No officer wrote that claim into state records, and the county file holds only measured language about subsurface flow. What remains are names and a trail that winds through routine forms and brief decisions that often precede ordinary work. The forms placed Ellison at a quiet junction with a simple task, while extended daylight made schedules stretch longer than intended. The notes placed Ortega near scenic ground where tourists look for berries while guides keep them from soft edges. Rusk moved between stops along the highway like any deputy in a spread-out burrow where minutes stretch and details scatter. The file closes with repairs completed and a line that reads "Outcomes unresolved," which is common language when records conflict and rumors persist. The stories. The night guard, who logged footsteps beneath the church basement. He logged the first footsteps at 2:14, then again at 3:05, and nothing about those times made sense. The basement lights stayed off, the motion sensor blinked idle green, yet something moved under the concrete where no hallway existed. The night guard was named Alaric Boone, age 54, a retired freight dispatcher who took quiet work after his divorce. He covered the overnight shift at a weathered church on a bluff, a place with a gym, a pantry, and a low stone basement. His simple goal for that Tuesday was making rounds, checking doors, keeping the coffee hot, and finishing a crossword before sunrise. During his second loop, he heard the first set, a faint two-beat rhythm under the boiler room, steady and human. He froze by the cinder block wall, his pencil lifted, and he realized he could feel the vibration through his shoes. He marked the time in his pocket notebook, then radioed a single check-in to keep the board honest. The church sat near a small river where old mills once ran, and tunnels stitched the slope like forgotten seams. He had heard stories from lunch volunteers about a coal chute, a dumbwaiter, even a choir passage sealed long ago. None of those old features mapped exactly to the boiler room, which sat on fresh concrete poured after a flood in 2005. Alaric finished the round and told himself it was heat pipes, which seemed reasonable, though the tempo was wrong. The boiler was off to save fuel, set to wait closer to dawn, and the thermostats showed a flat night. He waited near the fuse panel and heard it again, slow steps south to north, then quiet like someone listening. He walked upstairs and checked the parking lot, which held a single sedan from a choir tenor who worked late. Across the street, the antique shop was dark, its sign unlit, the display of rotary phones a grid of dust. The guard wrote the second time down, circled it, and added a question mark he would rather have avoided. He kept a clean log because writing straight helped his nerves. A trick learned dispatching trucks through winter storms. His notebook already listed door tests, flashlight levels, and notes about the food pantry deliveries with initials and counts. Now it held two odd entries about a place that should have been solid fill and reinforced slab. On Wednesday, he set a baseline, because the simplest first step is confirming the pattern before trying explanations. He arrived 10 minutes early, brewed coffee, and walked the perimeter before the staff left and the alarms armed. He chalked a thin line along the boiler room floor, just a mark to see if any hairline crack shifted. At 2:17, he felt the same two-beat rhythm. Heel, then toe, careful, like someone stepping between puddles. It moved toward the old pantry wall, paused, then returned, and he heard a small scrape, as if brushing stone. He checked the chalk line and found nothing disturbed, which frustrated him more than if he had found scuffs. He called the on-call contact listed as Pastor Lionel Cade, age 61, a spare-voiced man who rarely slept. The pastor answered and said the church once tied into a storm culvert and the city sealed it after floods. He added that the map might be wrong, since old projects drifted from paperwork when donations moved faster than permits. The footsteps returned at 3:11, and he recorded them by holding his phone against the wall, letting the mic listen. The audio picked up a rhythmic, bassy thump and a single metal tick, like a ring hitting a pipe. He labeled the file with the date and the time and sent it to himself because he backed up everything. On Thursday, he walked the block in the afternoon and spoke with Rhea Voss, age 47, the daytime custodian. She said a volunteer once mentioned a hatch under the choir risers, then shrugged and said that was before her time. She also said a city crew excavated near the alley last winter, chasing a water pressure loss on the block. He pulled the Public Works hotline and asked for archived lines, using calm words and the steady cadence that gets patience. The operator routed him to records, where an email arrived with basic utility diagrams marked revised after 2005. The drawing placed a retired branch running 30 feet under the church, labeled Service Abandoned with a faint dotted spur. He printed the map and folded it into his pocket, then took his shift with a small knot riding his stomach. That night, the sound came earlier, 1:59, and closer to the North Foundation, which meant a path existed. He pressed his ear to the block, ignored the smell of dust and fuel oil, and heard soft breathing between steps. He decided to compare his notes against external clocks, a habit from dispatch that filtered coincidence from signal with patience. He checked transit schedules and found a freight delivery to the antique shop at midnight every other day, closed route. He marked those days with a triangle in the margin, then noticed the footsteps fell hours after the truck departed. On Friday, he asked the food pantry director, a patient woman named Mavis Alcott, age 50, whether someone used the basement. She said the pantry closed at 6 and the keys were tracked. Then she looked worried and asked if something happened. He told her he heard odd noise, nothing dangerous yet, and he would keep her informed before calling the police. He reached out to a friend who knew Boots by tread, a park ranger named Pietro Licari, age 42. Pietro listened to the phone recording and said the spacing suggested a careful adult, not a kid, likely carrying weight. He told Alaric to watch for a scrape on the off foot, a marker of someone testing boards or stones. That night, Alaric brought a cheap wildlife camera from a hardware store, just a unit that logged sound and temperature changes. He set it in the boiler room, not for video since there was nothing to see, but for time-stamped audio. He also sprinkled a narrow ribbon of flour near the expansion joint because footprints sometimes post where eyes cannot. At 2:08, the floor hummed lightly, the air felt cooler near the wall, and the camera clicked after a shift. Later, he played it back and heard a new detail, a small spray like water under pressure, then a hand tap. It sounded like someone touched a pipe and felt for vibration, which made the knot in his stomach tighten. On Saturday afternoon, he visited the public library and asked for old fire insurance maps, the kind surveyors hoarded. The librarian brought a set from 1948 and 1963, which showed a coal room under the choir. A narrow passage ran toward the river, marked as service, with a note stating shared utility with neighboring parcel. The neighboring parcel matched the antique shop, which made sense to old builders who shared trenches and split costs when money was scarce. He copied the sheet and took it to the pastor, who studied the lines, then sighed and rubbed his jaw. The pastor said a previous board closed the passage after a minor flood, then let the city handle whatever remained. Alaric asked permission to open the old choir risers to check for a hatch, and the pastor agreed to supervised access. They pulled 2 sections and found only plywood and dust, which meant the hatch was either gone or moved. Yet along the north sill, a set of nails showed different age, darker and uneven, as if boards were reused. That night, the footsteps ran later, almost 4, and quicker, like someone in a hurry who disliked being underground. He thought about calling the police, but worried he would deliver a false alarm and lose the trust he needed. Instead, he called the non-emergency line and reported suspicious subterranean noise, and the dispatcher logged it with a routine number. On Sunday morning, a congregant named Basil Ortega, age 60, told him he once saw steam venting in the alley. Basil said it happened near a rusted rectangle that looked like an access panel, then he made a helpless shrug. He also said an unfamiliar white van loaded crates behind the antique shop 2 nights earlier, long after the truck left. Alaric used his lunch to walk the alley, where he found a metal cover sunk into cracked asphalt beside an old drain. The cover was not city standard, the screws mismatched, the edges marked by recent scrapes where a bar pried. He took photos from 3 angles and emailed them to the pastor, then placed a tiny pencil mark by a bolt. He returned that night and listened, and when the footsteps began, he watched his phone clock and checked the flour. The new powder held a single faint dent by the joint, not a full print, but enough to show pressure. He leaned closer and smelled faint bleach, which meant someone cared about leaving little behind, a detail that narrowed possibilities. On Monday, he flagged the city water department and asked whether any reports showed pressure fluctuations overnight in that block. A supervisor called back and said there were brief spikes every few nights around 3, like a valve opening and closing. He added that an inspector noted a missing cap on a retired service branch near the river last winter. That call changed the tone because pressure spikes paired with footsteps turned from mystery to infrastructure problem with risk. He told the pastor he would ask police for a walkthrough, then called the same dispatcher and requested a non-emergency assist. A patrol officer arrived with calm posture and a flashlight, listened to the audio, and agreed to a careful look. They checked the alley cover first and found the pencil mark missing, replaced by a fresh smear of dirt and oil. The officer requested a utility truck, and a crew appeared with a wrench and a portable meter that hummed softly. The crew measured sound through the cover and picked up flow. Not strong, but a whisper moving in pulses like breathing. They paused for a supervisor, who arrived with a locked case that held a camera snake used on drains and conduits. The team fed the lens past the cover and into a rough concrete passage that curved toward the church foundation. The view showed shoe scuffs on the dust, then a brass T-valve patched into an old water line with tape. The supervisor killed the street feed, then pointed at the tape and said someone had no license for that kind of work. He also said a misthreaded cap could vent gas from the adjacent service, which shifted the conversation from curiosity to hazard. The officer requested a second unit to secure the block, and they cleared the alley while keeping voices low. Inside the church, Alaric stood by the boiler room while the utility meter ticked, confirming a slight pressure bleed through the slab. The footsteps started again, softer this time, then stopped when the water cut out, which pinned the pattern with confidence. He radioed the officer, who whispered that someone was still down there, then signaled the team to quiet. A darker shape glided past the camera lens and a hand reached the valve, then froze when it found no resistance. The hand wore a thin mechanic glove with a tear at the knuckle, a detail that stood out like a flag. The officer announced presence through the cover, voice firm without volume, telling the person to stay still and breathe easy. A minute stretched heavy, then a voice answered, shaky and tired, saying he was stuck because the valve handle jammed. The team opened the cover and escorted out a man in his late 30s, pale, layered in dust and damp. He gave his name as Trenton Vale, age 38, the owner of the antique shop across the street with deliveries. He said he entered the old service passage months ago after a plumber showed a way to run a supplemental water line. He said he needed pressure for cleaning and steaming items, though his meter and bills did not match the usage schedule. He admitted he liked the privacy, then insisted he never touched the gas, which the utility crew would later verify. They checked his shop and found a narrow door behind a rack of film cameras that opened onto the same cracked alley. There were wet footprints on the threshold, hex-patterned soles with a little drag on the right, matching the sound spacing. There was a box of brass fittings, a saw with minimal filings, and a cardboard tray holding mismatched valve caps. At the station, according to the later report, he told them a contractor left the tool and he only learned by watching. He said the passage felt safer at night because the street was empty and he liked the quiet under the church. He also said he heard a bell once through the stone and timed his movements between scheduled campus patrols. The city documented the patched valve, sealed the retired branch, and fined the shop for unauthorized connection and trespass through utility right-of-way. The gas line near the valve showed no tampering, which eased everyone, though the near miss tightened throats along the block. The police shared a copy of the dispatch log, noting the initial call as checked and secured. Ulrich printed the log and glued it into his notebook beside the first pencil scrawl about the 2-beat rhythm. He added a short summary, stating that the footsteps tracked to an illegal water tap under the slab, then paused. He wrote that the timing aligned with utility spikes, and the alley cover thread marks confirmed regular access before the shutdown. The pastor thanked him in a staff meeting, with witnesses confirming calm handling and careful records that guided city response. Rhea patted his shoulder and said the flower idea was odd and smart, then promised to mop where he dusted. Mavis delivered coffee and said the pantry would have closed for days if the water had been fouled by sediment. Pietro called and laughed softly, saying the drag heard in the recording matched the right boot scuff found at the door. He said the pattern on the sole looked like an old surplus boot, hex blocks that turned slick on damp concrete. He liked that a simple tape recorder pinned a path better than a dozen guesses and said, "Well done." Weeks later, the utility crew returned and filled the passage with flowable mix, a gray slurry that hardens without voids, They left a small marker in the alley for the map, a stamped square showing the retired line and closure date. Inside the boiler room, the floor stayed quiet. The green light blinked the same, and the chalk line gathered dust. People asked Alaric if he was scared while listening to footsteps underneath, and he always answered with a half smile. He said fear is different from alert, and alert is what he used when tracking trucks through black ice before sunrise. He also said the quiet afterward felt heavier than the noise because silence makes you question whether you imagined everything. He kept the notebook in his locker and reread the first pages when he doubted why small details matter during routine nights. The triangle marks still sat by the delivery days, and the circles still highlighted the times that repeated like a clock. He had added a final entry, stating that listening is a skill, and that meters and maps are companions. Trenton kept the shop open under a suspended operations agreement, limited hours, supervised water, and a written promise about deliveries. He came by once with a receipt and asked the pastor to sign a community service form for repair work around the lot. He paused near the boiler room door and stared at the concrete, then thanked Alaric without meeting his eyes. Alaric nodded and said, "Take care," then wrote a line later that night about how people choose their own pressure. He meant water and he meant life, and the line read corny on the page, so he crossed a word and moved on. He folded the notebook closed, poured fresh coffee, and walked the church perimeter while the river hummed under the bluff. He still listened in places others ignored because careful listening had made a map where drawings ended and footsteps began. He carried the printed utility sketch until the paper softened, then kept the new revised copy with the closure stamp. He filed both in a manila folder labeled basement under the church, just a marker in case memory failed years later. In his mind, the story stayed simple. A man heard footsteps where no hallway should run and wrote the times carefully. The notes pressed outward into witnesses, maps, meters, and one rusted cover that told the truth when a bolt turned. The payoff was not drama, but a good fix, which is better, and the quiet afterward made sense again. The town that locked its gates at sunset. Residents of Graybridge in Skagit County, Washington, described a routine that rarely drew attention until the winter of 2019. Every evening, near civil twilight, the municipal swing gates at the north and south arterials were rolled shut and locked. The practice dated back to a flood mitigation plan that repurposed surplus highway barricades as neighborhood barriers. People accepted the ritual as ordinary, and few questioned who kept the keys or why the schedule never shifted. When an unexpected series of incidents clustered around closing time, the pattern became the story itself. The first documented night belonged to Everett Lang, 58, Public Works Maintenance Supervisor, on call to verify generator levels. He drove the service pickup along the riverfront approach while watching barometer readings fall and the wind stir powdered snow. According to dispatch logs, he radioed that the western gate lamp flickered despite a recent bulb change. He parked beside the frame at 4:21 p.m., marked the hinge plate with chalk, and indicated he would return a socket set. State records show his time card ended at 4:29 p.m., though the truck remained on site until after dark. In interviews recorded later, several drivers said the gate looked closed before sunset, which was unusual given the posted schedule. A school bus turned early, leaving 2 students to walk the long frontage path in rising wind. The bus contractor filed an incident note, and the county file from 2009 was cited to explain alternate routes. That file referenced water on roadway conditions during king tides, not early closures or padlock changes. Investigators never confirmed why the chain was moved one slot tighter on that particular evening. 2 nights afterward brought a second account from Mara Jensen, 33, substitute teacher, visiting a friend in town after a late shift. She reported the southern gate partially open at 4:47 p.m., with the reflective panel rocking slightly and then stilling as if held. Some locals claimed she misread wind gusts against the sign face, though the crosswind was recorded as modest. Jensen stated she called the non-emergency line and left a message describing a figure near the hinge post. Archived notes indicate no callback and no official sighting recorded that week. Graybridge had reasons to prefer early closures, including opportunistic dumping on the river pullouts during shoulder seasons. Yet, council minutes show the adopted ordinance framed the gates as temporary storm furniture, not nightly perimeter control. The language specified seasonal deployment during marine layer advisories and elevated creek stages. In practice, the town applied the hardware every evening from October through March, then loosened schedules without a written addendum. Records conflict on who authorized the habit, and signatures on renewal notices rotate among three clerks. On the last Friday of November, the wind eased and the river flattened under an inversion haze that kept sounds oddly near. Everett returned with a junior technician to adjust the sticking hinge on the western frame. They noted ripples on pooled water inside the shoulder that looked like traffic vibrations without any visible vehicles. The technician logged a vibration test with a wrench against the post and marked slightly dull resonance. Minutes later, the gate swung with a slow finish despite grease on the bearing surfaces, and the lock clasp settled without a rattle. That same hour, Deputy Colin Ward, 47 County Sheriff's Office, ran a patrol loop that included the northern approach. He observed families cutting across the gravel to reach the diner before the gate closed, moving with the practiced timing of regulars. Ward kept a neutral pace, logged plate numbers, and waved two teenagers through the opening with a small vertical hand motion. He later wrote that the gap appeared exactly the width of a compact car mirror span, which struck him as intentionally measured. Reportedly, he considered waiting by the hinge but diverted to a noise complaint near the mill. December brought earlier darkness, and the gates began meeting the sun halfway on clear days that should have stretched the schedule. A hardware store owner said the padlocks sometimes felt warm even in freezing air, then cooled quickly when exposed. A fisheries volunteer said the river sounded less present near the metalwork, like a muffled channel on a radio. Another resident described 3 short knocks from the empty lane that made a dog pull hard toward the ditch. Investigators never confirmed a single physical cause, and weather data offered only modest anomalies. Attention sharpened after a delivery driver photographed the southern gate with the chain fastened through a hole that did not exist earlier. The image shows a neat circle in the panel skirt, clean-edged, free of burrs, positioned where the angle iron meets the cross brace. Public Works said no one issued a work order and the spare panel in storage had no matching hole. Some locals claimed the photo captured glare rather than new metalwork, though the exposure time was short and the light soft. Archived notes include a printout marked question feature with no follow-up entry. During the first week of January, a light snow covered the approach lanes and kept tracks readable until the plow made its pass. A single set of boot prints approached the western gate from inside town, stopped at the hinge side, then angled away toward the river footpath. The returning path never crossed back toward the lane, and the tracks faded where wind scoured the edge berm. Dispatch logs record Everett calling the footprint pattern in, requesting guidance before opening the frame for the morning commute. Ward logged arrival 8 minutes later and photographed the sequence from 4 angles with flash reflection on the chain. Ward's report states the hinge bolt showed a bright ring where recent friction removed road film. He measured the chain slack and counted links, arriving at a number that did not match the training sheet. The difference equaled 1 link, which could be explained by minor tension variations under cold conditions. He wrote that the padlock keyway pointed down when he left, a habit he maintained for rain management and quick checks. State records include the photo, and the keyway appears horizontal under direct flash. A week later, Jensen returned to town for a weekend district workshop and stayed at a friend's rental near the river. She walked to the store before sunset and paused by the southern gate after hearing a short metallic tap. She saw no vehicles and no pedestrians except a runner on the far path whose headlamp bounced steadily. Jensen described the tap, repeating twice, followed by a faint hiss like air leaving a tire at a steady rate. She declined to give an interpretation and asked that her name be recorded without additional context. By midwinter, the gates closed at a time that residents could predict without consulting the posted sheet. Tourists missed the window and parked along the highway shoulder, then walked in under a sky that turned quickly from silver to blue. A volunteer ushered them along with a flashlight and instructed them to step clear of the hinge arc. Public Works kept a second set of keys inside a red box at the fire station and signed them out for emergencies. Reportedly, 2 keys went missing for a weekend, then returned without a log entry. Everett's final detailed entry came during freezing rain, when locks often seized despite preventative lubrication. He noted a ticking sound from the shackle area that reminded him of thermal snap in roof tin. He warmed the lock body with a portable heater and watched the built-up moisture steam away in a thin ribbon. The ticking continued for 30 seconds and then stopped without the usual follow-on rattle. He closed the gate and left the heater running while he checked the opposite frame under a flat gray sky. The following afternoon, a contractor found a child's mitten lodged between the latch plate and the panel rib at the northern gate. No missing child report existed, and the school confirmed perfect attendance for the relevant classes. Some locals claimed the mitten blew from a passing stroller and bounced into the gap during a brief gust. The knit fabric was dry despite earlier drizzle, which the contractor wrote felt inconsistent with the time on his delivery receipt. Archive notes show the item was placed in a lost property bag and never claimed. Ward conducted a simple experiment with a digital recorder, a tape measure, and a bag of sand to dampen vibrations. He placed the recorder near the hinge and opened the gate to the width used during the dinner rush. He listened to playback and heard 3 faint taps spaced evenly, each followed by a very low tone near the noise floor. He repeated the test on the southern gate and captured 2 taps and no tone. Dispatch logs note that he filed the recordings under equipment anomalies without linking them to any active case. A regional inspector visited after a minor collision, bent a reflector bracket, and sent a cyclist to urgent care. The inspector stated the frames met standard, the locks were common issue, and the postings looked adequate for winter conditions. He recommended painting the chain with high contrast bands so drivers could judge closure state at a glance. The town followed the advice and logged the paint purchase under safety materials, second quarter. Records conflict on whether the painter applied a primer coat that might have altered chain stiffness under cold temperatures. In late February, snowmelt filled the culverts, and residents described a hollow roar under the approaches at odd intervals. The gates continued closing near sunset, neither early nor late, as if synced to a clock hidden somewhere in the routine. A visiting journalist asked who owned that clock and received 3 different answers, including a vague reference to legacy timers. Public Works denied any timer beyond the wall calendar pinned above the parts shelf. Some locals claimed an older control box once existed, but no one produced a serial plate or a retired schematic. On the last documented evening before the spring schedule eased, Jensen walked with Everett along the river path after a school event. They discussed ordinary matters and kept their hands in their jackets while the temperature settled close to freezing. At the western gate, they heard a small clink like a coin touching metal without falling. Everett lifted the chain 1 link and set it down, and the sound did not repeat. He checked the latch face and saw a faint crescent in the dust, then wiped it clean with a sleeve. When daylight extended past commuting hours, the gates were rolled open and nested against their posts, and the town breathed differently. No ordinance changed, and no notice was printed, and the habit slipped away as quietly as it began. A few residents kept notes about the winter schedule, including times, weather, and small irregularities that never shaped into conclusions. State records contain everything necessary to describe the mechanics and almost nothing that fixes intent. The files remain available, and the keys hang on a peg behind a steel door with chipped paint. The stories. Ranger Station Ledger flagged a missing permit at dawn. At first light, the Ranger Station Ledger spat out an alert that one backcountry permit number did not reconcile with issued copies. The overnight dispatcher circled the entry in red marker and wrote missing, which was the only word nobody wanted to see. Latham Reyes was 39 and worked as a field ranger who managed trailheads, radios, and the old metal key cabinet. He clocked in early, poured coffee into a chipped mug, then read the ledger twice and felt the room shrink. The permit number matched a reservation tied to a solo hiker who had not checked out by yesterday's sunset. The name read Tomas Halper, age 37, and the emergency contact line ended with no answer recorded. The station had a routine for this exact situation, which looked simple on paper and complicated in real life. He pulled the overnight radio log and the reservation printouts, then called the county dispatch desk for archived calls. The dispatcher on duty answered with a clipped voice and confirmed one brief call near dusk from a nearby pullout. The call dropped before the location pinged twice, so they logged it as incomplete. The park sat in a mountain chain that people photographed from a highway turnout that smelled like hot breaks in summer. Locals said the place had thin borders where trails overlapped with old timber tracks and forgotten mining access roads. Latham set a simple goal for the day, which was to verify whether Tomas walked out early and skipped the desk. Some hikers did that, and he hated how often it fooled staff into sounding alarms. He decided to check cameras at the east exit and the service road past the old quarry first. He taped the ledger alert to his clipboard, added radio times from the night log, then headed for the truck with a paper map. A gray Subaru with mud caked behind the plates sat in the day lot under a fading trailhead sign. The plate number matched the permit file, so the vehicle check became the trigger that changed the plan entirely. His voice on the radio stayed steady, but he felt that familiar pressure behind the eyes that always came with missing cars. The last ranger who ignored a parked car overnight still had nightmares about the aftermath that followed. Latham walked a slow circle around the Subaru and took photos of the interior through the windows. He counted a blue windbreaker, a gas station coffee cup, a folded receipt, and an orange wrapper with the corner torn off. He logged the items in his notes and called the plate to the county line to confirm registration. The response came back clean, with a mailing address to a city 2 hours away and no active warrants. Two backpackers in their late 20s shuffled by and looked at the Subaru like it might answer a question. The woman spoke first and said they passed a guy at the junction near the ridge after a late climb. She described a man with a close beard, a faded cap, and a limp that looked like a boot rubbing wrong. She added that he asked about the shortcut to the lake, which did not exist, then waved and kept moving. The guy with her nodded, then said the man had a new pack that made his shoulders ride up like he was not used to it. Witness statements always came salted with memory gaps, yet both details felt real in a way that mattered. Latham thanked them, wrote their names and numbers, then reminded them to check out at the station before they left town. He pulled the dash cam card from the station truck used on the evening loop and plugged it into the office laptop. The last loop showed nothing on the service road, then a fragment of taillights near the quarry gate at gray dusk. The timestamp matched the brief call window from dispatch, which made his coffee taste like metal. He froze the frame where the taillights blinked and magnified the shot until the pixels bled and swam. The shape of the car looked like a small pickup with a roof rack, which did not match the Subaru in the lot. He saved the frame, printed it, and stapled it to the ledger alert for a later look. He called the quarry foreman on the number posted by the locked gate, then asked whether any crews ran equipment after hours. The foreman swore nothing moved, then said the gate lock had a stiff shackle that hated winter, which did not help much. A call came in from the store in the valley, where hikers bought dehydrated chili and overpriced fuel canisters in bright colors. The clerk said she recognized the name from the morning before and remembered that he used a prepaid card with a scratched strip. She mentioned he bought a paper map and a plastic whistle, then asked if everything was all right, which Latham did not answer directly. He requested the receipt copy and any camera footage that covered the register and door. The clerk said the owner saved footage for 2 weeks as a shoplifting deterrent, so she would print stills from around 9:15. The mention of a prepaid card added a wrinkle that he did not like, because it cut down searchable paper trails by a lot. He wrote it down anyway, then underlined it twice and moved on. He drove to the ridge trailhead and checked the kiosk log where people still wrote their plans with dull pencils. The entry for Tomas said out on Saturday, back by Sunday, route Circle Lake counterclockwise, Camp Night 1 near Inlet. The loop around the lake had 4 clear stream crossings and 2 spots where cairns tempted new hikers into old fire scars. He looked for additional notes and found a faint scrawl that read, "Saw tent near logjam after dark," which lacked a dateline. He took a photo, then turned to the ridge where the wind pushed low clouds across a face that liked to break ankles. He walked the first mile with his radio on scan and found fresh boot prints that veered onto the quarry track despite a closed sign. The prints were deep on the outer heel, which matched the reported limp, and the spacing suggested someone who favored the right leg. The quarry track dropped behind fir trees and came out near a rusted gate with a battered lock that still hung closed. A torn strip of fabric in a dull blue shade clung to a stump where a person might squeeze past the hinge. He bagged the strip, wrote the time, then looked up to see crows cross low and fast like bad messengers. He followed the track to a flat where water pooled in old ruts and reflected a sky that never looked friendly in March. A mound of gravel showed fresh tire marks with an odd zigzag that looked like someone learning a clutch by feel. He crouched and ran a finger along the rut wall and felt dust that had not settled into crust, which put the timing close. The quarry foreman had denied any late activity, so the marks likely tied to whoever drove near the gate at dusk. He shot photos, measured the width with a broken stick and a tape, then plotted the line on his map. Back at the station, he spread the notes, photos, and the printed taillights frame across a desk that had a gouge shaped like Idaho. He listened to the archive dispatch call again, which captured a short, breathy voice, saying quick words that fractured with static. The caller had said something that sounded like lost permit or lost person, then a muffled clack, and the line fell quiet. He played the clip 5 times and wrote down 2 interpretations with a question mark, which was the style the supervisor liked. The radio log from hikers listed a second-hand report from a fisherman who heard a whistle near the inlet after dusk. The fisherman had used a cheap handheld radio with a weak battery, so the recording lived as a line of text and not a voice. That was fine, because the whistle purchase from the Valley store had already planted itself in his mind as a breadcrumb. Late morning brought a small-town police officer named Mara Key, who handled the highway stretch that touched the park border. She was 33 and worked patrol shifts that crossed into everything that did not fit elsewhere. She parked by the Subaru and walked up with a notepad and a friendly face that could turn sharp in a second. They stood by the hood and traded notes that barely needed full sentences after years of joint calls. She said the highway turnout camera caught a gray pickup with a roof rack at 1842 heading toward the quarry. She added that a volunteer firefighter reported an unusual truck bed loaded with tarps after 9 near the county line. Latham held up the taillight's print and said the shape tracked with what she had. She nodded, then asked whether the missing permit might actually be a duplicate number from a previous season. He blinked once, then went very quiet because that question hit a different nerve. Permit numbers rolled over every winter long before the system went digital, and some older blocks had gaps and repeats. The ledger printed the flag because the manual book showed the number as issued to a different name in late fall. He dug into the archive cabinet that breathed dust and pine and pulled the worn book from the shelf, marked 98. The ink on the page showed the same number assigned to a group from a climbing club from a city 3 hours west. The lead name read Rayan Cade, age 32, and a phone number that matched a defunct area code now recycled. He compared the handwriting from both permit slips and saw the same loop on the number 4 in the dateline. That did not make sense until he looked at the clerk's signature, which matched a retired staffer who kept garage sales every summer. He wrote down the name and the year in words so the report would not kick back for formatting later. He stepped outside and called the retired clerk on a personal number found in an old staff tree near the copier. The woman sounded bright and happy to hear a ranger voice, then quieted when he explained the duplicate number issue. She said she used to pre-write permits during busy seasons to speed lines, then fill names in with a light touch. She added that some pads got stored in a desk drawer after winter changeover and might have ended up in the surplus box. That surplus box sometimes went to the annual trailer sale with old radios and busted snowshoes for pocket change. He felt his throat go dry and asked whether any blank slips could be floating in the world with the seal already stamped. She said it was possible, then apologized and said nobody had asked about that practice since 1998 ended. He thanked her gently and wrote a note for the supervisor that would not make anyone cheerful. The store clerk sent stills that showed Tomas at the counter, holding a paper map in a stiff hand with a white bandage. The timestamp read 9:12, which lined up with when the trailhead sign-in sheet filled up. A second still showed a man behind him wearing a quarry company cap who bought batteries and jerky. That detail landed like a small stone in a bigger pond because of the quarry track prints and the taillights frame. Latham called the quarry foreman again and asked to see the shift roster for the past 2 days. The foreman sighed and said he would email a screenshot since office rules required written requests for full copies. The screenshot arrived with smudged names and a note about 2 contractors hired short-term for cleanup after heavy rain. One contractor matched the cap logo from the still, which felt like a door creaking open after a stubborn winter. Latham and Officer Key drove to the quarry safety office, which smelled like coffee and oil and a fight nobody wanted. The foreman met them with a clipboard and a face that said he hated unexpected questions on a weekday. Key kept her voice friendly and asked to speak with the contractor who wore the cap with the same faded stitch. The foreman said the man was named Vicente Rowe, age 36, who lived in a rented room above the tire shop. He added that Rowe had left early the previous night because a radiator hose blew near the county line. Key asked to see the truck, and the foreman pointed to a gray pickup with a rack and tarps bunched in back. The bed still held a coil of new rope, a rusted shovel, and a muddy cooler that smelled like lake water and gasoline. Latham felt that metallic taste again, which was never a sign of a good afternoon ahead. Rowe arrived from the far lot with hands raised and a look that said he already knew why they were here. He said he had filed a work order for the hose, which they confirmed with a carbon sheet and a phone photo. Key asked whether he had been near the lake after dark, and he said he left the quarry road to test the hose under load. He added that he pulled aside at the turnout near the inlet and heard a whistle that made him wonder about a prank. He did not call anyone because his phone was dead after streaming music during cleanup, which landed badly but not impossibly. He said he saw a small tent by the logjam and a lantern glow. Then a figure waved and yelled something about a permit. Key wrote it down and asked for permission to look inside the cooler, which Rowe granted with a shrug and a steady jaw. Inside lay 2 empty water jugs, a crumpled fuel canister sleeve, and a plastic whistle in an unopened bag from the Valley store. Back at the station, Latham laid the whistle sleeve next to the store receipt copy and saw a mismatch in barcode digits. The sleeve in the cooler matched an older shipment code that the store had sold out months ago during a discount run. That meant the whistle in the cooler likely came from a different source than the one Tomas bought at 9:12. He looked again at the still where Tomas held the map with the bandaged hand and noticed a line of dried mud on the cuff. The mud looked pale and powdery, which matched the quarry fill used to stabilize the service road after storms. He wrote a timeline that pinned Tomas at the store, then likely at the quarry road, and finally near the inlet after dusk. He wrote a parallel line for Rowe that put him at the quarry, then on the same road, then near the inlet while testing a repair. The lines felt too neat until he added the duplicate permit issue that now seemed like a hinge rather than a footnote. He dug into the city address on file for Tomas and found a rental building with mailboxes that had newer locks installed last winter. The property manager answered with the cheerful speed of someone who wanted a clean day and already knew it was lost. She said a man with that name had paid cash, kept to himself, and left 2 weeks early with no forwarding note. She also said a different name had appeared on a delivery label once, which the courier mentioned when buzzing the wrong unit. The alternate name sounded familiar, and it clicked only when he reopened the 1998 ledger page. It matched the lead from the old climbing club permit, which tied the duplicate number to a person who should have aged out by now. The detail did not mean they were the same person, but it did mean someone liked to reuse names tied to old paper. Officer Key ran the alternate name through an old case index that kept records of search and rescue incidents on paper and microfilm. A report from 2 winters back described a fake distress call at the same inlet that lured volunteers into a risky night crossing. The caller used a prepaid phone and a different name, yet the voice transcription carried similar clipped phrasing and rushed breaths. The motive at the time seemed like a cruel prank, and nobody had linked it to anything tangible after the snow melted. Latham rechecked the gap between the whistle report and the dropped call and found a sliver where a person could move a short distance. He called the firefighter who reported the unusual truck bed and asked whether the tarps had looked wet or pulled tight. The firefighter said the tarps were tied tidy and dry, then added that the driver waved like a man who wanted to be seen. Afternoon shadows drew long, so they hiked to the inlet with a drone from the county that tracked heat signatures. The drone skimmed treetops and sent back images of the logjam, the bank, and the flat near the old survey marker. No body, no fresh campsite, just flattened grass near the logjam where a tent might have stood during a short decoy. They found two sets of prints, one deep on the right heel and one narrower with an even stride that cut toward the quarry track. Near the waterline, he found a paper map folded in a way he recognized from the still, which made his chest go tight. The map held a smear of pale mud and a faint X near the old prospector's trail that dead-ended at a slide. He bagged the map and stared at the X until it felt like it stared back, then marked the spot on his own copy. The slide path opened into a shallow cut with wooden forms left from a never-finished footbridge project funded in 2005. He followed the forms until he reached a square of ground tamped hard as a table near a tree with a scar. The earth felt too tidy for random hikers, and the tree scar had fresh resin that caught light in a clean yellow bead. He brushed aside pine duff and found a buried plastic box that held a stack of old permit slips with the seal already stamped. The slips matched the retired clerk's pre-written style, and several had Rayan Cade typed in a cheap courier font. A second stack carried blank lines and a stamp pad spot like a kit for people who wanted official-looking paper for a plan. He felt a chill that did not come from wind, then called key over and photographed the box from 3 angles. The twist revealed itself slowly, as if embarrassed to be simple after such a day of layered rumors and tire marks. Someone had staged a missing hiker using a duplicated permit number and a prepaid trail of receipts to trigger a standard response. The purpose was not to vanish, but to bait a small law enforcement swarm toward the lake while a second person moved cargo from the quarry. The zigzag tire marks in the gravel now read like a practice route for a heavy load that needed a quiet window. The fisherman's whistle and the tent glow created a cautious pause in anyone tempted to check the inlet on foot. The taillights near dusk were a partner vehicle that pulled close to the logjam, then backed out during the start of the false search. The target was not a person, but scrap copper and tools stored in a locked shed near the service road past the old quarry. They found the shed lock sliced clean with a battery saw when they returned with the foreman and a bolt cutter key. The inventory list taped inside showed spools of copper wire and fuel additives that had resale value in cash-only salvage yards. The contractor truck bed dimensions matched the load footprint on the dusty floor, and a partial shoe print matched the even stride near the inlet. The limp prints belonged to whoever wore a new boot wrong, which now felt like another layer for misdirection rather than a true injury. When confronted, Rowe did not fold, but the quiet employee who ran the tire shop room rentals gave a statement. He said Rowe met a man who matched Tomas in the parking lot and moved tarps between vehicles near sunset. He added that Rowe left after 9 with the bed loaded to the rails, which aligned with the firefighter observation with uncomfortable precision. The county prosecutor would need clean evidence, so they worked careful and slow to gather the chain. The paper box of pre-written permits became a centerpiece, since it explained how the ledger flag could be predicted in advance. The duplicate number drew attention at dawn by design, which pulled eyes away from the road where cargo rolled past a gate. The prepaid receipt at the Valley store placed a decoy at a predictable time, which witnesses could later repeat with conviction. The dropped call created a sympathetic recording in the archive that every incident review would elevate in urgency. The taillights in the dash cam and the turnout camera filled the gaps with enough glow to animate a story that felt real. None of it solved every moment, yet together it built a scaffold sturdy enough for charges that did not fall apart. They never found a body by the inlet, which fit the theory that nobody had been in true danger that night. A week later, a different store camera captured Tomas in a neighboring county buying a tire patch kit with a clean, unbandaged hand. The clip went into the case file under reportedly cited, along with a printout of the copper sales ledger from a salvage yard off the highway. Rowe took a short plea on theft and tampering with evidence, which irritated people who liked long answers. The paperwork on the duplicate permits triggered a policy change that barred pre-writing anything since 2021 onward. The retired clerk cried in the parking lot when she learned her old shortcuts had fed a scam, then hugged Latham like a nephew. He told her people adapt to pressures they do not design, and the fix mattered more than the blame. When the Subaru finally left the lot on a tow, the trailhead looked as ordinary as a grocery aisle on a Tuesday. Officer Key stood with her hands in her jacket and watched the tow lights climb the hill toward the highway. She said the simplest cons always hide in systems that run on habit and paperwork. Then she smiled without much humor. Latham looked at the ridge where the wind never ran out, then at the ledger that still sat on the desk. He thought about the whistle and the map and the soft faith people place in official stamps and good intentions. Later, he locked the station, and the rafters creaked in the cool like an old house learning a new rule. He drove past the turnout and looked once at the lake, which held its secrets with the stubborn patience of cold water and granite. He told himself they had not solved every detail, but they had nudged the pattern toward daylight, which was enough for now. The disappearance of the highway patrolman near Ash Fork. A winter front moved across the high mesas west of Williams when a patrol unit stopped near Ash Fork on the interstate shoulder. The first call to county dispatch described a parked cruiser with lights flicking in windblown grit and no visible officer nearby. The officer was David Keller, 39 highway patrolman, assigned to traffic enforcement along the corridor between Seligman and Williams that week. He left the substation after a routine briefing about black ice formations reported by truckers along shaded cuts east of town. His stated purpose, according to state records, was to monitor a construction taper set along a narrow bridge approach near mile marker 264. The cruiser camera showed lane markers bending through frost and snow feathers moving like powder from the plow ridges. The microphone captured only windrush and an ignition idle that shifted pitch as the alternator compensated for light bar draw. Maria Ortega, 47, long-haul driver, was hauling insulated produce toward Kingman after picking up palletized freight in Flagstaff near dawn. Her log noted a slowdown near the Ash Fork interchange and a trooper unit angled behind a stranded sedan with hazard lights. She reportedly saw a figure in a dark jacket walk from the cruiser toward the guardrail where the shoulder turned to brush. Her statement, filed that night, added that drifting spindrift obscured the figure almost immediately after the door shut. She did not stop because a second unit was expected based on advisory messages that reached her cab radio. Dispatch logs for that afternoon reference Keller advising a plate check on an older sedan with temporary tags that did not match the make. The recorded time, taken from console entries, put the event near 9:15 as the snow intensified around low scrub hills. A reply from records confirmed a mismatch that required a further stop review under procedure regarding possible fraudulent registration display. Traffic camera frames captured the sedan signal across the taper before easing into the shoulder where cones began. The sedan position remained consistent across several frames until a burst of powder erased details beyond the guardrail. Archived notes from the local maintenance yard describe a temporary drop in visibility near the bridge over Partridge Creek during mid-morning. A crew foreman wrote that crosswinds from the north pushed powder through the taper and rattled plastic drums against the barrier ends. Those notes mentioned a lone cruiser parked short of the bridge nose, with the driver door open wider than expected in such wind. The yard memo carried no conclusion about the patrol activity, only an instruction to reposition drums once visibility returned. The author of the memo later said he believed the trooper waved him through while attending to the sedan driver. State records list Keller as a 9-year veteran with prior wildfire support experience and winter operations training completed during 2 recent seasons. He qualified on roadside risk protocols that included 3-point positioning of flares, with an emphasis on avoiding smoke recoil near fuel vapors. Training outlines suggest he would be unlikely to leave his engine running without attention for longer than a few minutes during a live stop. The cruiser computer recorded multiple authentication pings, which indicates the engine remained on while the unit computer stayed awake. Investigators never confirmed whether door sensors captured an accurate timeline since the harness connector had intermittent faults noted earlier that month. A ranch hand named Luke Porter, 32, seasonal worker, crossed the frontage road to check drifting across his gate while winds pushed snow into shallow dunes. He later told deputies that the sedan driver leaned on the guardrail and smoked while the trooper spoke on the radio. Porter described the driver as medium height with a bright scarf, though he admitted distance, snow glare, and wind made everything seem grainy. Some locals claimed the scarf detail belonged to a different sighting on a different day, and records conflict on the time. Porter insisted the memory fixed around the sound of a freight horn rolling across the draws east of town. At midday, the construction taper crew returned from a salt run and found the sedan door ajar against the rail, scuffed by spindrift. The car interior held a coffee cup, a glove, and a folded paper map soaked at the creases by driven snow. County deputies found the keys under the driver's seat and a registration stub that matched a plate number different from the displayed tag. The county file from 2009 includes a guidance form about counterfeit temporary tags that investigators cited during the first briefing. They towed the sedan to the yard while a search team worked the brush south of the bridge where cattails lay crushed in wind lanes. The cruiser remained on the shoulder with the light bar switching through patterns as the battery bus dipped under alternating loads. A second unit arrived and found the radio on local repeat and the shotgun still locked in its bracket under the console. The driver's seat carried Keller's jacket, and his hat rested brim down on the passenger floor as if placed there to avoid wind. Boot prints led from the driver door toward the rail and then along the barrier toward the creek bed cut by winter flow. The prints doubled back once, then broke apart where powder filled the depressions and obscured direction near chaparral that clung to the slope. Searchers followed the creek line downstream toward the junction where ice forms brittle shelves shaded by basalt outcrops. They flagged scuffs that might be boot scrapes against rock ledges and found a small light clipped to a vest strap under a snow lip. The light belonged to Keller based on an engraved initial, though the battery showed charge and the clicker worked without failure. A glove liner lay 7 strides away, and a plastic evidence ruler set in photographs showed a consistent tread shape in compressed powder. The pattern matched the department-issue boot ranked for winter operations, which gave confidence for a concentrated sweep along the left bank. During the afternoon, Maria Ortega delivered her trailer to a Kingman yard and returned to speak with investigators about the scarf and the smoking driver. She said the driver stood still, as if bracing against wind while keeping the cigarette cupped, a habit she recognized from mountain passes. Her recollection placed Keller between the driver and the cruiser, with his shoulder radio lifted toward his face near the guardrail posts. Investigators never confirmed a radio transmission during that precise moment because a repeater outage occurred when power fluctuations hit the tower. That outage appears in utility reports and in dispatch logs that reference brief static bursts followed by dead air and reset signals. A wildlife officer named Eli Warren, 58, retired wildfire crew and seasonal ranger, joined the search along the creek meanders after volunteers formed grids. He knew runoff channels around Ash Fork from years of mapping nesting sites before spring and recognized several sink pockets that collect powder after wind events. Warren found a patch where snow seemed scooped in an oval and pressed by a heavy form sliding downslope from the rail. He marked the spot and radioed, then followed a short skid toward brush where a torn cuff rested under a juniper limb. The cuff stitching matched Keller's uniform issue based on a later lab note included with photographs and chain of custody forms. Archive notes from a prior winter mention a similar drift pocket that formed under a jumping wind at that same bend near the bridge turn. A plow foreman described how cars could appear to settle into a whiteout while only yards away from bare gravel strips. The note advised units to overrun the cone line and stop farther past the bridge nose to avoid the funneling gusts through the guardrail posts. Keller's vehicle position, marked in spray paint after the tow, sat just within the funnel sector described by the maintenance memo. Whether he knew the risk is unknown, though his training files include a section on wind eddies around barrier terminations. State records show several calls from travelers reporting a figure walking the median hours after the initial stop near Ash Fork. One call suggested the figure carried a bright cloth that whipped in the wind and then vanished behind a salt truck spray. Another caller described a uniformed person moving along the barrier and then crouching between drums as a semi passed with slush boost. Investigators ran those reports against lane camera frames, but could not align the timestamps with known truck movements recorded by the waystation. The mismatch left a gap that investigators noted without drawing conclusions, because records conflict across sources and clocks drifted during the outage. Late light washed the draws as a helicopter searched with a thermal unit that read the landscape in pale washes of heat and shadow. The camera picked up coyotes moving single file and a herd of pronghorns scattered across a fence gap south of the interstate. No human heat bloom appeared along the creek banks, where teams marked probable flow paths between junipers and basalt shelves. At dusk, the teams withdrew as temperature fell and a clear sky promised a hard freeze over the drift pockets. A deputy stayed with the cruiser as a tow prepared for removal, and a tarp covered the windshield to protect interior prints. The sedan owner, contacted through registration files, lived in Mohave County and reported the plates stolen during summer before the snow season. He said he sold the car 2 weeks earlier to a buyer who paid cash and took the vehicle without a name entered on the title. The description given by the seller did not match the figure Maria recalled near the guardrail smoking through the wind. Investigators never confirmed whether the buyer and the driver were the same person because the transaction lacked a recorded bill of sale. A later inquiry noted small drill marks near the plate bracket that suggested a quick swap performed without care for alignment. Some locals claimed a patrolman once warned about a narrow step near the rail where the fill slumped during heavy thaw years ago. The county road book included an entry about that settle with a recommendation for riprap that budget delays postponed beyond another season. Snow filled the depression in layers as wind drove crystals against the rail and then into the low along the slope. A person stepping from the shoulder could slide, lose balance, and strike brush before arresting on a shelf near the creek bend. Searchers tested that route and found scraped bark, small threads of uniform cloth, and granular ice chips stuck to the fabric. The last confirmed radio position for Keller triangulated near the bridge nose using signal strength from 2 towers before the repeater outage rolled through. A technician later explained that strength readings mislead during ground refraction under cold inversions over the mesas. The estimate still set him within a short walk of the cruiser at the time Maria saw the jacketed figure by the guardrail. That alignment supports the view that he had not walked far before. Snow and wind obscured his path across the drift pocket. Whether he pursued the driver on foot or stepped away to inspect the sedan underside remained unsettled after weeks of review. The county file from 2009 contains a checklist for cold weather searches that the sheriff cited when expanding the grid into the draws. The list emphasizes boot impressions in powder and the capture of small textile fragments where brush scrapes occur along narrow paths. Teams returned over several days and documented scattered impressions that led nowhere once sun crusted the surface and wind reset the field. A scarf fragment appeared near a cattail stand and matched no clothing from Keller's locker or department inventory logged at the substation. Some locals claimed it proved the driver moved along the creek line, though investigators never confirmed a full scarf from the fragment alone. In the following week, the snow receded along south faces, while shaded pockets kept their stiff crusts under cedar boughs. Maintenance crews removed the taper and set a warning board about drifting near the rail gap by the bridge nose. The patrol cruiser remained off-duty as lab teams worked the interior and finally returned it to the yard behind a chain-link fence. State records note that Keller's radio keyed several times after the outage cleared, though no voice transmissions followed those key events. Technicians attributed the signals to automated resets and not to manual use, a conclusion recorded after firmware inspections at the communications shop. Several archived notes, reference calls from hikers along a section of old roadbed west of Ash Fork where cinders surface in thin patches. They reported finding a badge clip near a juniper, though the badge itself was absent and the clip showed corrosion from prior seasons. Investigators marked the find as uncertain due to lack of provenance and possible placement by wind or by animal movement across Camp Detritus. That entry sits beside a note about a lunch receipt found in brush near the bridge, a receipt that matched Keller's purchase from a Williams diner. The receipt time falls within the morning window and supports his presence on the route earlier than the stop near the taper. Months later, runoff deepened the creek and exposed stones where snow once stacked and preserved shallow marks along the slope. A volunteer team found a radio cord near a root snag, its plug scuffed and the insulation cut by a sharp edge. The department radio in Keller's cruiser still carried its cord, which made the creek find a likely unrelated item from unknown origin. Some locals claimed it showed parts shed in a struggle, yet investigators never confirmed a second radio issued to Keller that winter. The find joined a small shelf of objects in the evidence room with tags that read uncertain and deferred pending future comparison tests. Records conflict on the final sighting time because different calls reached the sheriff line and the highway line as power returned in uneven blocks. A tourist bus reported a figure in reflective trousers east of the interchange, walking against traffic with an arm raised toward a plow. Another traveler said a uniformed man stood behind drums and waved a flashlight below waist level near the bridge nose. Neither sighting aligned with camera frames due to snow sheets over the lenses and abrupt exposure shifts when trucks passed. The investigative summary notes that conflicting timelines, complicated verification, and left sequence uncertainties that never closed despite successive interviews. The official notice lists David Keller as missing while off the shoulder of the interstate near Ash Fork during a winter weather event. The notice states he exited his vehicle during a stop involving a sedan with mismatched registration and did not return to the cruiser. It also states that search operations covered the creek line, the brush slopes, and the construction taper area with negative results beyond clothing fragments. The write-up includes references to dispatch logs, to state records, to archived notes, and to the county file. From 2009, the final line records that investigators never confirmed a route of travel or conclusive contact with any identified driver from the sedan. The bridge approaches now carry riprap under the rail where the settle once formed a shallow step hidden by wind and snow powder. A small marker for a generic safety reminder sits near the shoulder where the view opens toward distant hills and a thin band of pines. Drivers pass with steady speed, and the wind still pulls through the guardrail posts and rattles the plastic drums when storms cross the mesas. Some locals claimed a trooper lights the shoulder during those storms, and a flicker rides the spindrift before sliding into the draw. The remark appears in several informal statements, and investigators never confirmed any source beyond reflection and powder-crossing headlight beams. The stories. Dispatcher, who kept the secret from a bridge call, the call began with the sound that never leaves him, a river hush that sat under a thin voice. On the log, it read as a welfare check near the west span. The timestamp matched the shift change. The tower camera sent a smeared view of headlights, and the wind pushed rain and slanted ropes across steel. He wrote the first line in block letters. Male caller. Alone. No traffic lane blocked. Unknown age, unknown intent. In training, they, from the start, had said the first 10 seconds decide the rest. He believed that for years. He had a plain goal that night. Finish paperwork early, drink the cold coffee anyway, and get home before midnight. Kellen Duarte, age 38, worked as an emergency dispatcher in a river town that never liked headlines. He lived quiet. 2 rooms over a grocery where the owner knew his name and saved him bruised peaches. He was good at the slow voice and the clear questions. He kept a notebook with dates and little arrows. On the tape, his opening line sounded the same as always. County Communications, tell me what is happening. The caller coughed, then said he was at the railing near the center truss. He asked for no sirens, Kellen clicked a marker on the map and moved the cursor a hair so the unit tags would not overlap. He asked for a name, and the caller hesitated like he was picking one from a shelf he had not visited. "Call me Ross," the man said, then added something about the water looking like foil if you did not blink. There was a push of air, like a mic against a jacket, and the traffic under the bridge hummed steady. Kellen kept the tone even, told Ross that people could meet him where he stood, and asked what brought him there. "Someone I loved died on this bridge," Ross said. And his voice steadied, like he had waited to finally say it. In his log, Kellen wrote the words that mattered. Loss stated. Prior connection to scene. No weapons reported. Calm speech. From the other console, Nira scrolled road closures and passed him a sticky note that read, "Northbound lane is clear." He muted the room feed for a second, so the printer squeal would not land in Ross's ear and spook him. He asked the year of the loss, and Ross said it fast, like it tasted bad. 2014. Kellen repeated the year and let the silence work while he dispatched a patrol car and a medic unit in the background. He knew the story people told about that year. A sedan climbed the curb during a storm and hit a contractor. The papers had run one photo of cones and a dropped hard hat. No names followed, just an archived blurb and rain. From the tower camera, a freight train horn carried along the riverbank, then faded as the unit names flashed en route. Kellen asked if Ross knew the person who died by name. Ross said he knew the face and the last words. A small thing changed in Kellen then. A sound from the record shelf in his mind fell flat and stayed there. He once took a midnight call from a work crew foreman near the same span. He kept that tape in memory. Ross said the last words were not for him. They were for a dispatcher who told the crew to hold 10 minutes. Kellen tapped the headset cushion, careful to keep the room quiet, and asked where Ross had heard those words. Ross said he had heard them from a phone found in a cracked case under the North Pier after the storm. He said the phone worked for one day after the rain stopped, and that he had played the last message recorded. He said the message was from County Communications with a different voice, and it told the crew to stay clear. Kellen felt the old shift wash through him. The storm year had ended in a tangle of rumors and a closed memo. He had read that memo while filing tired overtime sheets. He filed it without speaking and chose to keep moving. On the camera, one pair of headlights slowed near the shoulder as if a driver could sense the weight of the rail. Kellen radioed the nearest cruiser to stage 2 blocks off with lights off, and he asked Nira to notify the medic quietly. He asked Ross to tell him who the contractor was, and Ross said the name with a short stop between first and last. The name matched the contractor mentioned in the closed memo, except the memo had spelled the name without an accent mark. Kellen wrote the name as Ross said it, exact and careful, then underlined it once for the transcription that would follow. He asked Ross why he came now and not earlier, and Ross said an anniversary sits on the mind like a stone. He also said that the memo never named the dispatcher who told the crew to hold, which was why he had called. Kellen understood the shape of that ask, even if the words around it were soft. He was not supposed to name staff. The policy existed for safety and sanity, and it covered nights when grief needs a door and someone tries that door. He told Ross he could share what the record allows, and he asked if hearing the process might help him stand. Ross said hearing the process might help, though he refused the idea of sirens again and asked for plain truth instead. Kellen kept his sentence length slow and warm. He said that storm calls can trigger staggered staging for worker safety. He said if there were downed lines or compromised joints, a hold might be given while a state engineer was patched in. He also said that every such hold carried timestamps, and that those stamps were kept by policy for 7 years. Ross breathed in and asked what happens when 7 years have passed, and Kellen answered before he could think of softness. He said the system cycles recordings to deep archives after 7 years, and some are erased when retention windows expire. Ross said he had a copy in case the archive could not confirm. Then he claimed the voice on the tape named a company. He said the tape used a phrase that a dispatcher would not use unless someone off-channel asked for a careful delay. Kellen had heard that phrase once. It was the night a junior engineer requested a slow approach while a supervisor closed a lane. The phrase was not suspicious by itself, and yet, in memory, it wore the shape of a request he never liked. He asked Ross to read the phrase, and Ross said it. Hold 10 for a clear handoff if site control is missing. Nira glanced over with a look that said, "Do not get pulled into the river." Kellen nodded and kept the pace steady. He told Ross he could not speak to motives of old voices, and he could not name a colleague or contractor from memory. He said he could meet Ross with a sergeant who knew the policy, and they could file a supplemental report for records. Ross said he was tired of reports. Then he asked a new question. Was someone paid to push that hold in the storm? Kellen chose his words like glass marbles placed in a line. He said he had not seen evidence that proved a bribe. He said he had seen maintenance slips that missed dates in years with bad weather, and he had seen budgets cut twice. He said contracts sometimes shifted mid-season, and miscommunication could look like intent when viewed through grief and time. The cruiser staged in the dark lot of a bait shop, and the medic idled near a closed diner with frosted windows. The tower camera picked up two figures near the midspan, and the wind made their jackets move like wet flags. Kellen asked Ross if someone stood with him, and Ross said a cyclist had stopped and was holding a flashing light. He asked the cyclist for the phone, and the cyclist, shouting through wind, said he would hold the light where Ross stood. Kellen brought the cruiser onto the bridge, slow and quiet, then asked Ross to look over his right shoulder for headlights. He said he would keep talking while the car approached, and he would ask simple things about the person lost. Ross began to tell a short life. He said she had a laugh that came in bursts, and she liked folded maps. He said she had taken a night shift to help a younger sister, and she kept a lanyard with a faded tag. He said he watched her set cones before the storm hit, and he watched the curve where the sedan took the line. He said no one saw the driver afterward, and the report guessed water pushed evidence downriver where it turned to silt. He said the tape he found made his chest hurt because someone with a badge kept people where the wind was worst. Kellen said he heard the pain and he believed the sincerity. Then he asked Ross to step back from the rail 1 foot. He said small choices add minutes, and minutes stack into plans, and plans turn into days that someone can live through. The cruiser moved a foot at a time. The officer called in with a whisper to confirm eyes on the subjects. The wind kicked a tab of paper along the sidewalk, and the camera caught it hopping like a small animal in rain. Kellen asked Ross about the cracked case at the pier, and Ross said the fisherman who found it gave him the phone. He said he cleaned the mud with rice and heat, and the screen woke like a held breath and showed the saved audio. Kellen pictured a kitchen table with towels and a humming space heater and the stubborn work of saving a last voice. He told Ross that someone who would do that kind of work could also stand away from the edge and breathe tonight. Ross said people kept calling him crazy when he brought the phone around, and one clerk said to forget old storms. He said he would go if someone could promise the message would not vanish into a hole where things get lost. Kellen had a rule: never promise anything that depends on someone else. He made a different promise instead and wrote it down. He said he would take a copy himself, and he would log it as a citizen recording attached to a supplemental report. He said he would list the time and origin as provided, and he would initial the line and add a contact number. Ross went quiet, and the wind filled the line again, and the cruiser stopped a car length away with no flashers. The officer on the bridge said he saw a second person keeping distance, and the cyclist raised the light toward the railing. Kellen asked Ross if hearing a small true thing might help him come off the rail. Ross told him to say it plain. Kellen told him there was an internal review back then, and it did not find a bribe, but it did find a silence. He said a manager failed to file a conflict disclosure, and a vendor had a nephew on a crew scheduled for that week. He said the manager resigned before the report made the rounds, and the findings lived behind a line marked personnel matter. He said he had read that line with tired eyes and wished it said more, and that was the part he kept. He did not say the other part out loud, which was the line about a recommended reprimand for delayed notifications. He did not say the name of the dispatcher who missed a handoff while moving units during the storm shift. He did not say that the reprimand belonged to him for a calendar mistake that lost 2 minutes when the server lagged. He believed the 2 minutes had not caused the death, yet he carried them like a coin that burned his pocket. Ross stood very still. He asked why no one told the public that someone had been asked to resign quietly. Kellen said the county tells what it must by law, and the rest gathers dust and waits for someone to ask again. He said he understood that wait, then asked Ross to walk toward the cruiser while the cyclist kept the light behind. Ross said he wanted to hand the phone over himself and watch it enter the chain that could not be erased. Kellen told the officer to receive the device and document the handoff on camera. Then he told the medic to stage closer. He kept talking to Ross about the quiet details of grief as the officer moved with hands open and calm shoulders. Ross stepped away from the rail, and the wind made the tension a little louder. Then the cruiser door clicked open. The officer took the phone and read the time on the screen for the camera, then thanked Ross and nodded at the cyclist. The medic stepped out with a blanket and stood near, and the cyclist said he would bike Ross home if that helped. Kellen set the line to a low hold and told Nira to mark the recording flagged for retention review and supervisory copy. He also wrote a note for himself to call records in the morning and ask for a manual pull from the deep archive. He would say the citizen copy exists and should be paired with any surviving log from the storm year for clarity. He would not say the rest, which was that he had been the one to misread the calendar view during a switch. He shifted to the closing questions that help people move. Any harm today? Any plan tonight? Any safe place to stay? Ross said he would stay with a friend who owed him a favor, and he would bring coffee to the cyclist as thanks. He said he would wait to hear if the recording matched the archive, and he would not visit the bridge again at night. Kellen said someone would call him within 3 business days, which felt safe to offer, and he wrote his own number anyway. He signed the log with a quick line and filed the incident under welfare resolved with evidence collected and no injury. The bridge camera caught the cruiser pulling away slow while the medic followed, and the cyclist lights faded toward the trail. Nira slid over a cup with fresh coffee and asked if he was okay, and he said yes, since people had stepped off safe. He picked up his notebook and drew a small square around the words he had written, which read, "Keep the silence clean." He drove home as rain dripped from the awning of the grocery, and the owner waved from a dark window with a thin smile. He unlocked the door and set his notebook on the table. Then he took the spare tape recorder from a drawer beside the sink. He spoke the date and the incident number and a short summary. Then he said 7 words that were just for the tape. He said the bridge call reminded him why small errors multiply and why a person can choose to carry them alone. In the morning, he brought the tape to the records clerk as a personal note to accompany the citizen copy for context. He did not include the part about his own reprimand, which lived on paper in a file that no one requested. He told the clerk that the caller needed confidence, that the system held memory, and the clerk said that part was done. 3 weeks later, a letter arrived to confirm the match, and the archived call contained the same phrase and timing. The letter said the review board would annotate the old memo to reflect the vendor relationship that had been missed. It also said the findings still pointed to weather and a panicked driver as primary causes rather than any delayed instruction. Kellen stood at the window and read the lines twice, then folded the letter and slid it under the notebook cover. He walked the long way to work and past the river that pretended to be quiet, while tugs moved lumber under the span. He thought about the part he had kept and judged whether it belonged in daylight or whether it still lived best in private. He decided to hold it until it served someone to hear it, which was not the same as hiding, and felt closer to care.